Hey, what is going on, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Quarbit, and I'll be your host today talking about some Imperator Rome. It sure has been a while since I've touched on Imperator, certainly at least a year or so, not since like 1.3 or something I think. But today we are finally getting the 2.0 Marius update, which will bring a ton of new stuff, and with all that new stuff, of course, comes a little bit of confusion, a little bit of stuff that needs explaining, and a lot of stuff that you would have missed out on if you haven't been keeping up since the 1.0 version. And there's no need to lie, I think a lot of you haven't been keeping up since the 1.0 version, which is perfectly fine. The game's been doing pretty okay. That's of course not amazing by any standards, but it certainly has come a degree further than which it started at the very beginning. Before we get into it, of course, I'd like to thank Paradox for giving me this early copy of the game so that I can learn a couple of the new features and hash out some of the details before I make this sort of video. So shout out to the team for handing me a copy. I really do appreciate that. Alright, there's no need to delay, let's get right into it. Now, right off the bat, of course, you'll see a couple of different things. The map hasn't changed all too much. It was already very detailed from the very beginning at launch. Only a couple of new tags over here, maybe like one new religion. There really isn't too much to talk about. Some of the things with the Antagonids are, of course, a little bit different. We're going to be touching a little bit more on what's happening over here because this has to do with the DLC that just launched as well, the Heirs of Alexander. But for the sake of today's whole little pseudo-tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at Thrace, which is one of the more interesting nations that we have in the newest update. This is just a little blurb about the history. You can go ahead and read this if you want to. Essentially, we're going to have all of the successor nations of Alexander's empire trying to kill each other. So basically the Seleucids, the Antagonids, Egypt, Thrace, Macedon, you know the whole deal. But what I want to focus on today is more of the basic level stuff, because if you haven't been keeping up since 1.0, you're going to be confused by a lot of stuff. Obviously, first of all, the interface is different. All of your things are on the left sidebar now, which is much nicer than it was before in my opinion. Now all the icons are, easy to tell what they represent, and it doesn't confuse you with random portraits of gods or whatever. And of course, like most other Paradox titles, you're going to have the important stuff come up here in the top left when you have to address them. Alright, let's start very simply by talking about the resources at the top. Obviously, you have your treasury, which each month increases or decreases based off of how much you're spending. Then of course you have your manpower, which is increased each month depending on things like your pops and your subjects. We'll talk a little bit more about pops later. They have changed significantly since 1.0. And then now we have something called political influence. Political influence has, in some sort of a way, taken the role of mana. So instead of having like 4 different, mana categories, now we just have this thing called political influence. It's kind of similar to Hoi 4, but also kind of not, and we'll get more to that a little bit later. Then we have military experience. This is generated each month, and you can also get it based off of things like your legions and your levies and how well they fight, and when you disband levies you get more of it. I'll talk more about military experience later on, but what you need to know is that military experience is what you use to go over here and get yourself some traditions. We'll cover these in a lot more detail later, but basically these are the things you want to go down to improve your military and stuff like that. So, more military experience, more traditions, you fight better. That's good to know. Stability is now a 0 to 100 sort of thing. It's been like that for a while. There are various things that can change where it's going to rest. Things like your ruler's zeal might increase it each month, and the higher it is, the more stable you are. But also the harder it is to become more stable. Stability is kind of used a lot like a currency in this game. It generates each month or decreases each month, but you'll also be spending it when you do stuff like change laws, or if you have to integrate a culture, for instance. And then we have aggressive expansion. If you are an EU4 player and you're coming over to Imperator, you're probably confused, why is aggressive expansion a resource on the top bar? That's because coalitions would be really hard to sort of simulate in this time, especially with all of the tags around you. So coalitions don't really form in this game, not the same way that they do in EU4. Instead, your aggressive expansion is going to have a bunch of penalties on your internal stability and stuff like that. So think of it more like overextension in EU4 than as aggressive expansion. it's going to have more of an effect on stuff like your stability and your pop happiness than it will on other nations, really. War exhaustion is pretty similar to EU4. The longer you're at war, the more war exhaustion you get. War exhaustion affects happiness, it affects stability, and I think a couple of other things. And then of course you have tyranny. Tyranny is sort of like, if you do terrible things that your population generally wouldn't agree with, you're gonna get more tyranny. Tyranny affects your stuff like your stability, for instance, so you don't want too much tyranny. But tyranny can also increase the amount of goods and the taxation and stuff, and the amount of output from slaves especially. So high tyranny can have some good benefits, but it's especially bad if you're like a republic, for instance. You don't want to have a lot of tyranny. And then legitimacy, which is for monarchies. It's pretty self-explanatory. The more legitimate you are, then the more people are going to like your heir, and the more your common free man is going to, approve of your rule and stuff like that. If your legitimacy isn't high enough, then you're going to have a lot of loyalty issues from characters. Characters, of course, play a massive role in this game, as you might remember from 1.0. But things like civil wars and unrest and revolts are a lot more common than they used to be, I found. I don't know if that was a 2.0 version or if I missed something from before then, but it's definitely, more noticeable these days. Alright, I will get to all of these things eventually, but I'm actually going to do it going down this left side here. It's going to be much easier to explain things and remember them as we go down the left side rather than with the pop-ups. So let's start more with the map, for instance, because the map has changed a little bit, but not geographically per se. It's more like how population is organized and stuff. Since 1.0, there's been a lot of changes to territories, which they're now called. There's no longer a city and everything. Now you have settlements, which are the default and make a lot of sense. And then you have the cities, which are where your populations will congregate with each other, and generally you'll have big cities that produce stuff like research and manpower and stuff like that, while your territories might produce things like goods. You might have, for instance, more slaves in your territories, and they might produce things that you can trade to others for some more trade income. There's also a third type of territory, but those are very, very rare. I think there's only one at the beginning of the game, actually. We can check that out if we go to our territory rank here. All the blue are the cities that we have. There are even a couple of cities in tribal nations as well. But there's one, I think there's just one. Yeah, there's one, I think metropolis, yeah. Over here in India, there's a single metropolis. It's the only one in the game at the beginning, from what I can tell. But metropolises are really the same as cities. They just have more building slots, more taxation and stuff, I think. More goods produced as well, and they have different, requirements for what kind of pops are more likely to be found there. So let's talk about cities and territories. Here we have the province of Europa here. We don't actually need to look at the province interface right now. What we're more interested in is this stuff here. These are your types of pops. There are 5 types of pops. The newest one was actually added this update. We have nobles, which tend to produce more research than citizens. Citizens produce research and manpower. Freemen, they produce tax and manpower. Tribes tend to produce more manpower than tax, I think, if I remember correctly, and then your slaves just produce tax. But slaves also produce, like, overabundance in, let's say, salt, for instance. Because we have enough slaves, we produce a second salt. You can check out the rest of these stats yourself. I'm not going to talk too much about them because they're very easy to figure out without any exploration. But what we want to talk about is buildings. Buildings have changed massively. I don't even remember how many buildings 1.0 had, like 6 maybe? And they were all the same for every territory and stuff. But not anymore. We now have a bunch of different types of buildings that you can build for cities, and some of these aren't, unlocked until you do certain things and research certain technologies, but most of them are available from the beginning here. They all do a variety of different things, like increasing your research, and you can build more forts, and you can now build ports. That's a nice addition. We didn't have that before. So I encourage you to explore each of these things. There used to be a really important meta about libraries and academies, but I don't think that matters as much anymore, so we'll see what, the general trend of building buildings is going to look like in the next few weeks, I guess. And then we have tactical, which really just shows the number of forts you have. You can actually take a look at this. This is new, I think. Fort infrastructure is very important now, because before, you could build pretty much as many forts as you wanted. I don't think there was a limit before, but now there is a definite hard limit which can be increased. Going over it is going to give you great penalties for your forts. So at least we're not going to see, level 25 forts down in Egypt like we used to. That's a lot nicer. Moving back to pops here, we can also take a look at the info we have on our pops here. This opens a great big menu that's maybe a little overwhelming at first, but it's really simple. It's basically just the culture, the religion, and your class. These are the things you really need to focus on. Now, everything is done automatically nowadays. It's been like that since like 1.2, I think. Mana doesn't exist, so you can't promote or demote or convert pops anymore. Basically, the system runs itself, and I find it beautiful, to be honest. I really like the dynamic cultures and dynamic religions that are now added in, because basically now you'll have pops which will automatically convert to your state religion and your state culture. Not all the time. Some of them will, if they're too unruly, if there's too much unrest, then they won't convert, of course. But generally now they'll just do it by themselves, and you can change how quickly it happens through various modifiers, which we won't go into depth with today, but you can explore and find those yourself. They're all over the place, really. Here we have the pop class. Now, I should have mentioned with cities there are actually things like desired ratios for citizens, free men, nobles, and slaves, for instance, where your cities and your metropolises, and your territories, I suppose, are going to want to keep a general demographic of pops. Now, they'll automatically shift themselves about, you'll have some pops demoting, some will be promoting and stuff like that, but they'll generally trend towards a specific demographic, which will be shown here, and you can of course change that with a couple of buildings. For instance, in Academy, we'll increase the desired local noble ratio by 5%. Oh yeah, and pops will now just move themselves. I don't think slaves are allowed to automatically move, but things like freemen and citizens and nobles will freely move between territories. Tribesmen as well, I think. Provinces haven't changed too much. You're going to have your governor, they're going to have a policy, you can change governors, you can change policies and all that stuff. A lot of this works the exact same as it used to before. You just change this, change it to whatever you want. You can centralize your population for cities, you can decentralize it to move it away from a city if you're planning to, for instance, demote a city back into a territory. And you can of course decide to import any random thing here. Most of these, they just produce happiness for their various pop type, as you see here. They also have secondary bonuses which you can check out for yourself, but like you want more, I don't know, tech investment or something, then you click on papyrus and you're like, hey, Egypt, I want some papyrus. That'll earn us a little bit of money each month because we're importing it, and there you go. It's just that simple. This can be increased through various different means. For instance, we have something new here, which are the province investments. These cost 80 political influence as a base each, but you can of course decrease that cost. See, we have 72 here, for instance. And you can do something like, how about I want an extra import route then? You can go ahead and do that. It'll take about a year, and it'll be done. Okay, territory stuff done. Let's move on to our nation overview. Of course, you can take our ideas. These are the exact same as before. You just pick one. It doesn't really matter which one you go with. Corruption, you get loyalty and stuff like that. Boop, there you go. You just pick whichever ones are slotted here, and you're gonna get your extra little bonuses. If you don't get the bonuses. It's pretty simple. These are your decisions. They've now been moved into this menu, which is a godsend. I really hated having an extra menu for this, but here it is now. And if there's anything that you're not particularly, well-versed on, what I like about 2.0 is that they brought in something from CK3 that was really, really nice, and that's the ability to actually hover over these things. And now I set mine to lock in with a mouse click, with middle click. So you'll see that with the little white bar on the right side there. When I click middle mouse button, then it locks in, and you can see that this is now white, meaning it is locked in. You can actually do the same thing with characters, which is really, really nice. You can just keep on opening a bunch of these menus, and it's really, really nice. I just like how the system has been implemented. So if there's anything you need clarification on, the game has a decent explanation of things. I find that not everything has a tooltip, but many things do, so be sure before you look things up, just look around and see if there's anything that you might be able to find before you just have to open up Google Chrome or something. One thing about provinces I actually did forget to mention is now that there is a food system in the game. Obviously, provinces need food because your population needs to eat. If there's no food, people start starving, your population decreases, and everyone's having a bad time. This here will just let you see a bunch of your provinces to very easily figure out if there's a province you need to go to figure out any problems. Next we have the government tab, which looks a little snazzy these days. I really like the artwork they have in the background. So a lot of these things are similar to 1.0, there's not actually too much to change here. There are a couple of new buttons here, you can just go and discover these yourself. There's nothing too much to talk about except maybe the War Council, which just gives you free claims on one of the neighboring nations. It really is just that simple. And of course you can anoint someone to be your actual heir. Of course republics are going to be a little different in this menu, mainly with like the factions and stuff. But this isn't really as much an overview about the government types, just showing off the menus. Of course, same as before, we have all the offices. You can just go and select whoever you like. See, we have this guy over here, and there we go, he's got 9 finesse. He's got some good statesmanship. By the way, statesmanship is how they determine how good at their job they actually are. So we get 30% of 9 here, so it's going to be... I might round to 3? No, okay. It actually needs to become 33% to get to 3 out of 9. So as the statesmanship of these guys increase, they will slowly be able to reach their maximum potential. A lot about laws hasn't really changed. You'll just be spending some political influence and some stability to change some laws. Of course, at the very beginning, most of your laws are locked behind stuff like technology. You can see here you have to get the certain invention to get a certain law. We'll talk more about inventions later. That entire system has also been reworked. Let's talk about the economy. This is one of the tabs that I don't think actually has changed literally at all. Like, it's the exact same. You can increase your pay, you can decrease your pay, you know, increase taxes and stuff like that. Various different benefits and debuffs for deciding to work around with your money here, but nothing here has really changed that much. Next we have religion, which I believe changed significantly 2 updates ago, or it might have been the last one, I don't really remember. But religion's very different. Now what you have are 4 deities here. You can pick whichever ones you'd like. You can even pick from, outside of your religion, but you do get conversion debuffs for doing so, so I don't recommend that, but you basically pick, you know, what if I want to swap the Zelmoxian deity of economy over to, let's say, a Hellenic one. There we go. Costs you a little bit of stability, you swap that out, and you won't be able to, you know, get your blessing for a while. Essentially, the way the system really works is you have a deity of war, economy, culture, and fertility. Of course, they all do various different things, but there are certain extras. You see, this top effect is the one that applies all the time, by default, right? You can actually click on the little icon here to unlock the second bonus for 5 years. How effective it is depends on your omen power, which can also be increased over time with various innovations and your religious unity and stuff like that. Doing so locks the rest of them, but I will have access to that second bonus for those 5 years. Next we have the temples. These are kind of important, but they won't directly affect you too much. Basically, if there's a deity that exists, but there's no temple for them yet, then you can create a temple, of course. Whoever owns this temple can decide to put treasures in it, and those treasures will basically affect the territory that they're in. So these things here, they don't actually affect us. These don't actually do anything. You'll basically just have them for whoever owns it, I think. So if you have some relics in your treasury and you conquer a holy site of the religion that you're following, of course make sure it is for the deity. Each deity has their own. I don't think there can be more than one for each deity, but basically you can just sort of slap in whatever you'd like into there and it'll give you a small bonus. If I decided to conquer Akragas here, which is the temple for the Hellenic deity of war Heracles, then I could decide to put this into here and it would give a small local bonus. So they don't matter too much. The only thing is you can actually decide to sack these holy sites. You can just burn them straight to the ground, and of course everyone of that religion will hate you for it. But there is an achievement for doing it, so I mean, it's up to you. What's important to note is that the level of a temple is directly linked to the level of the territory. So because Olympia is a settlement, you can put 1 sacred treasure in the shrine. Abia is of course a city, so you can have 2. If it's a metropolis, you can hold 3, and so on and so forth. Next, we have cultures, which have gone under a massive change since you've last seen them probably. Cultures can now have a bunch of different things. Let's start with something very simple. So these are the cultures in your nation. What's important to note is the way your pops are integrated and various other things you can do with them. So because we start off here with Propontic and Macedonian integrated, you can basically have them happier, they produce more, and they can be used for levies and such. The more cultures you integrate, the more upset that your main culture will become. So the game plan is basically you can accept a culture, you can help to assimilate them, and then eventually you can, phase them out entirely to keep your main culture group a little bit happier. But it is important to manage your cultures now more than ever. Beforehand, I played an entire campaign without ever once touching these, right? But now they actually tie in a lot with your military. We'll talk about that a little later. But yeah, you will have to manage these. So if you want to change the civic rights of one of your cultures here, let's say Odrysian. So let's say I want to integrate them. Well, that's very simple. All we have to do is click on this little thing here. You can change the civic rights. And when you integrate a culture, all you need to do is move it towards citizen or noble. Basically, you can just grant them some rights to citizenship. That'll make them a little bit happier. It'll take some time, but once it's done, they'll be happier. You can use them for your military, and your integrated cultures will be slightly more upset about it. Of course, you can also do a bunch of decisions. This can actually help to improve the speed at which this happens, at the cost of stability, so I'm basically going to be tanking my stability here. You click this, it makes them happier, but it also makes this a little bit faster. And you'll see this down here. I think you can also revoke some of these, but not always. For instance, I don't think you can revoke the right of intermarriage, but you can revoke a couple of other things, I think. So that's the gist of all of it. As you're integrating a culture, it will actually slow down your stability improvement. In fact, it might even make it start to decay each month. But once it's done, that'll go back to normal. And then we have trade. All of this stuff is just, you can explore mainly for yourself. But one of these things I like to turn on is accept all trades and block surpluses. Surpluses give you a small bonus for different things depending on what trade good it is, if you have more than one of it in your capital. Now we get to the fun stuff. All the stuff that's been reworked is sort of like down here-ish. So military, that certainly has been reworked. So let's talk about levies. Right now we can't levy more pops because we are using them for our legions. I'll talk about legions in a second here. Levies are essentially just temporary fighting units which aren't as powerful as legions, and they will automatically be assigned their own different, unit types. Essentially, you're not going to be able to pick them, they're just going to be assigned to them, which is kind of why they're not as good as legions. They will also be led by their governor, which for this instance is our Basilius. So if you're a republic or you are a kingdom and you don't have access to legions yet, then your king or your leader's essentially just going to be charging into battle alongside them. Now, levies are actually based off of governorships. So for instance, we would have one for the entire region of Thrace. If we owned Macedonia, then we'd have another, set of levies here, and another one for Greece, and all that kind of thing. And then, of course, we also have legions. Legions are very interesting because you actually see the entire battle history of a legion. Legions can also have multiple commanders. Basically, if your legion is split into like 4 different groups, you don't have to manually assign more commanders, which is amazing. They'll essentially just pick from this little pool here of 4 that you can make. You can also edit the composition freely, which is something you can't do with levies. And of course, they are, standing armies, so they will cost you maintenance each month. What's interesting is, I actually don't know if there's even a way to remove the composition here. You can add things, for instance, if I wanted to add engineers, or if I wanted to add in heavy cavalry or anything, then I click this button, this would add 6 to it, but there doesn't seem to be a way to remove them from the army that exists. I can't right click these to decrease this number, so you might have to fully dismiss the legion army if you somehow mess that up, which would really kind of suck. And yeah, each governorship can only handle a certain number of units. That's why we can't levy any more pops, because the legions are already taking up all 9 of our cohort slots here. That number is increased by the pops I believe you have, as well as things like your culture acceptance. One last thing for legions here, you can actually get a couple of interesting bonuses over time. I don't think there's a limit to how many you can have, but there are a couple of bonuses and a couple of debuffs actually, which will give you various effects on each legion. So a very old legion might have a bunch of effects, which sort of makes it unique from another legion. If you lose a bunch of battles, then you might get poor negative effects and stuff like that, but generally speaking, you'll probably get some solid ones over time, and these cannot be removed, I don't think, so you know, once you have a distinction on your legion, it's sort of stuck there. Then we have traditions, which have changed massively. Even if you're coming from 1.5 over to 2.0, you can already tell this is a very different menu. So you're no longer locked to your one set of military traditions. And I don't even remember how far back traditions were a thing. They might be 1.0 still, I can't really recall. But now you have a bunch of different things here. Essentially, you can now unlock different tradition trees. You're no longer locked to the one, or in this case, two that you happen to have. There are a couple of things you have to do. For instance, if you want to embrace the Greco-Persian influence, then you're going to need a certain province or a certain invention, and you're going to need to integrate certain culture groups, of course. Traditions no longer just give you a couple of bonuses as well. They can also give you various other things. So for instance, if you grab Forged for War, then you can get a free navy. As well over here, you get another free navy, you can get a mega polyreme, and very similar to before, you will have to go down certain traditions to unlock certain navy unit types as well. That's a thing that's been around for a while. But it's not always about, you know, military bonuses. For instance, you can get military colonies through here, and when activated, certain things might get, you know, migration attraction and pop assimilation speed and stuff like that. So you can go ahead and discover each of these traditions yourself. To unlock one of the traditions on each of these trees, of course, it will cost you some military experience. I believe it's 100 per, and I don't think that number changes. But obviously, even if it costs 100, there's no way you're going to be able to go through all of these. So that makes each individual nation rather unique as you evolve over time and you adopt new traditions. If you don't use your military experience, let's say you're satisfied and you don't want any more traditions, then I'm pretty sure just increases your, you know, your fighting morale and stuff like that. Next we have mercenaries. These aren't too different. You just hire them, you know, you fight with them, you ditch them when you're done. They're often very, very expensive. Now, if there's one thing I didn't mention about militaries, it's that units here. Right, the units themselves. You can also build roads, but these are different now. You can build regular roads and military roads. I believe military roads can be built in enemy territory. If I'm not mistaken, I haven't checked it out myself, but that would make more sense. That would be the distinguishment between these two features here. What I really like actually is the new interface you can see here. You can select which you're going to have as your primary, your secondary, and your flank. This is just really nice. I like how it's visualized here as well. One of the things I did forget to mention is, of course, the food capacity on armies. This has been around for maybe 2 updates, I think. They will automatically grab food from the area that they're in, based off of the food production in that one territory that they're standing in. But it'll also draw from the province food capacity if need be. Essentially, food will be consumed instead of manpower for attrition, which makes it different from, let's say, EU4. Once your food runs out, then you'll start losing men each month, and, you know, obviously that's the worst outcome, because in Imperator, you get a lot less manpower than you do in EU4. Each cohort is also only the size of 500 men. It used to be 1,000, but they changed that now. I don't know what kind of ramifications that has on the whole system yet. Then we have diplomacy, which hasn't really changed too much. It just sort of looks like a much better menu than it did before. And then we have technology, which is by far the most changed thing in this update, I think. Technology is extremely different. Now you're going to have these trees here, which I'm pretty sure are the same. I don't think there are any differences between there might be a couple, but none that I'm aware of so far. So basically, you have these things called innovations. You get a new innovation every single time you make a new advance here. How quickly you make those advances are based off of the monthly research that you get from stuff like your citizens and your nobles, and that is multiplied based off of how good your researchers are at their jobs. Each advance gives you the exact same thing as before, just a slight bonus to various categories. But what's different now is that you're no longer given 4 options to pick from, and you don't have to spend money on any of these things now. Now you get innovations, and you spend innovations on these technical advances. So let's see, if I wanted to grab astral navigation here, I click on this. Let's say I want to buy this with one of our innovations, then of course we click OK, and that unlocks the next 2 things for us. So you go down the tree, You can discover a bunch. I haven't explored the whole thing myself, but particularly in religious, there are a couple of interesting things. It's not just limited to small bonuses and stuff. At first it might look like that, but no, there are really quite a few extras. For instance, you can have this thing called Major Syncretism, which essentially stops your ability to convert other pops, but it makes all unintegrated cultures a lot happier, and it increases your omen power. On the opposite side of those things, you can now basically just destroy religion, which is crazy. You can just decide no more, and you can desecrate temples, which restores stability, but your omen power is ridiculously low. Calling omens basically does nothing, which sort of makes sense because you're sort of going on an anti-religion crusade. You'll of course have to go down to certain inventions to change different laws as well. We talked about laws before, and how you'll need to pick up different inventions. So there's the religious one right there, and as you can probably imagine, it is not possible to pick up every single advance in a game. At least that was the intention that the devs said. There's probably going to be some mad lad out there that is going to break that and find a way to get every single one in the game, except of course for a couple which are mutually exclusive. But yeah, you're actually going to have to think about which you're going to want to buy. They're very different from each other. You have the 4 different categories with lots of different things to pick from, so you're gonna need to just figure out what you need to prioritize right now and choose accordingly. You can also plan for the future with this little planning mode here, which allows you to select these and be like, okay, I plan to go down to this path. And once you're done planning mode, you can decide to turn on or off that plan. You can also decide to search different things if you can't find it. So let's say I wanted to find militant Epicureanism, then we have that right there. It's outlined, it's very easy to find on this whole thing. Next we have characters, which haven't really changed that much. I feel like they tend to be more disloyal these days, but that might just be me. The only really big difference from 1.0 is this thing called the Great Families. These matter a little bit, they wield a lot of influence, and it's one of the reasons civil wars tend to break out so often. As long as you keep them happy by giving members within those families enough jobs on your council or, you know, in your military and such, then they probably won't be as much of a problem. But of course, you know, big families can wield a lot of influence, and simply by being influential, they might just plunge your entire nation into a civil war. And finally, we have missions. Now, missions are kind of more like the EU4 missions, except you don't have just one set of missions for your nation. You can actually select a mission tree, which is dynamic over time. Now, some of the mission trees are specific to different nations, a lot of them are DLC. For instance, I believe these 3 that I'm showing off here, numbers 1, 2, and 3, come with the Heirs of Alexander DLC, and these will deal with stuff like, let's say I wanted to take down the Antigonids or something, which will soon be collapsing. Then I can go down to crossing the Hell's Point here, I can start this mission. Doing so will give us this little mission tree here, which we can move around in and stuff like that. Some of these things are mutually exclusive. One thing I don't like is how some of the interface sort of obscures that. So it might be hard to see actually, but taking this would make this, you know, impossible to grab. So these 2 are mutually exclusive and stuff. But essentially, yeah, the whole point is to go down this entire tree, and then to finish the mission, you have to finish a specific one. In this case, it's Pontic Hegemony. So once we finish this, then we'll grab this and we can move on to a different tree. Alternatively, you can abort the mission tree, but you can't use it again for 20 years. A lot of the mission trees will be based off of your regions. A lot of them are based off of development, some of them are based off of conquering, and again we have a couple of unique ones. There might be a few more added in, which I'm not aware of, but those are generally the 3 types I know of so far. So there's your sort of brief overview into Imperator 2.0. I wouldn't consider this a full tutorial. If it were a total tutorial, I would maybe be going through a couple of the first few years of the game and showing a little bit of the warfare. But one of the important things to note about warfare is that all you have to do is occupy the capital of the region, and that will occupy the rest of these right afterwards, unless of course it has a fort on it. Forts will take precedence, and just like EU4, forts will actually siege back territory surrounding them. So keep in mind where your regional capitals are. They do matter a little bit, so, you know, make sure they're well defended. I tried to make this as simple as possible while not taking up too much time, so there are definitely things that I glossed over. Maybe some things I didn't explain too much. For instance, I didn't talk about navies at all because navies play a little bit of a lesser role these days. There are some things you can do with navies, but a lot of it is later on and stuff, so they don't matter a great ton, so I didn't, bother to mention them very much. Of course, if you enjoyed this overview of everything that's been included, like since 1.0 up to 2.0, then of course subscribing would be a massive help. I do plan to make a couple more Imperator videos if this one does well. Otherwise, I do make a lot of EU4 content if you're more interested in that. And if you found this video helpful at all, then leaving a like would be super appreciated. Of course, if there's anything that, you need clarified or you have a couple of questions, then, drop a comment down below. I'll try my best to respond to all the comments in the coming days after this video is released. But for now, this is Quarbit signing off, and as always, have a fantastic day. I'd like to take a second to thank all of the patrons we have for the month of February. Starting with those we have in the General tier: Quiet Guy, Brennan Arsenault, Ben Greenhagen, Torvalved, and Dire Avenger. Those we have in the Prince tier: Snow Raven and Rockbox 2020. Those we have in the King tier: Chewy Shoot and Natsuki. In the Elector tier we have TFLJ Martis, and in the Conqueror of Worlds tier we have The Watcher. It really does mean a lot to me, so thank you guys so much for choosing to financially support the channel. Really, I just can't thank you guys enough.